You know, you guys, whether or not we want to admit it, electric cars are here to stay. More than ever before, manufacturers are starting to come out with their own lines of EVs of every size, every shape, every type. So while that's probably good news for a lot of us out there, myself included, I absolutely love my Mustang Mach-E as a daily driver. What does that mean for the rest of us who spend most of our weekends miles and miles away from civilization in rigs just like this diesel camper van right here? Don't go anywhere, because on this episode of Chasing Dust, I'm exploring whether or not electric vehicles are the way of the future for off-roaders. What is up, you guys? Matt McAdam here, aka Desert Chief, your host of Chasing Dust, only on Driving Line, the show brought to you guys by Nitto Tire. And right behind me here, speaking of Nittos, I've got a whole bunch of them. I got some Ridge Grapplers over there, but I also have a set of Nitto Recon Grapplers right here. These are 37 1250 17s. They're going to be going on a new project that I'm going to be working on next month. And I got to tell you guys, I love the Recon Grapplers. It's the all-new all-terrain from Nitto, and they're fantastic for you guys if you're daily driving your off-road vehicles and you want to go play on the weekends. Go to Nitto Tire's website and check out the new Recon Grappler for yourself. I promise you, you're going to be impressed. We're going to talk about that project on a later episode of Chasing Dust, so make sure you guys subscribe to Driving Line so you guys can see what these tires are going to go on. But on today's episode, we're talking about something completely different. So this month, Jeep actually announced that they're going to be coming out with a whole new line of all electric vehicles. And Jeep, being an off-road brand, primarily building off-road vehicles, really got me thinking about the viability of electric vehicles for off-road, whether that's right now or in the future.
Future's now, old man.
Are off-roaders going to adopt electric vehicles? I myself have an electric vehicle as a daily driver, but you know, as things are right now, I probably wouldn't have one for an off-road vehicle or an adventure rig. So it got me thinking about, you know, whether or not off-road vehicles can really benefit from EV platforms and what that really entails and what are some of the challenges that are in the way of making them really good options for off-roaders. So without too much further ado, let's jump right into it. I've got a list of pros and cons of electric vehicles when it comes to their applications off-road. We're going to go through them. And my hope is by the end of this episode, you guys can determine whether or not you think electric vehicles are really the way of the future for off-roaders.
You serious?
All right, well, let's start off with some of the obvious benefits of having an electric vehicle off-road. What are some of the pros of having an electric vehicle off-road? The first one that comes to mind is the instant torque. Now, a lot of us do a lot of things to our off-road vehicles to make sure they have the power to get up and over obstacles or up sand hills or, you know, up difficult trails. Make sure we have the power to get up there and the torque to get up there. Well, we don't really have to do those things with electric vehicles. You don't have to re-gear the differentials. You don't have to add power adding modifications. They really just have a lot of instant torque because of the nature of electric vehicles and electric motors. So that is an obvious pro of electric vehicles off-road, is that torque is on demand and it's instant. So as soon as you hit the pedal, it's going to get going up whatever you need to get up and going. Doesn't need a lot of winding up, doesn't need a lot of revving up. It's just ready to go. As soon as you need the power, it's there and it's available. And so that brings us to our second pro of having an electric vehicle off-road, is the availability of where you can actually place those motors on the drivetrain. Now, if you look at a truck that already exists, like the Rivian R1T or their new SUV version, which is the R1S, you'll see that they actually have 4 motors and it has 1 motor per wheel. So what that does for you off-road is that it actually diverts power to the wheel that needs the most traction. And that's something that's done in a gas-powered vehicle or a diesel-powered vehicle using a limited slip or lockers or any kind of traction device. And those things have moving parts and they sometimes break or they sometimes malfunction, or sometimes it doesn't actually send the power to the wheel that needs it the most. With an electric vehicle, you actually have the ability with the computer to actually divert that power to the wheel that needs it most, getting you the most traction to get up and over whatever it is you need to get up and over. That is a huge, huge plus for off-roaders when it comes to, you know, going down trails that are a little bit more difficult that require that traction to be placed accordingly. Number 3 on our list of pros when it comes to electric vehicles off-road is more storage space. Now, of course, you guys have probably seen that electric vehicles often have what's called a frunk. You can see that in the new F-150 Lightning. You pop open what would normally be the hood, and underneath it, there's usually an engine. There's just this big storage compartment. The Rivian that I just mentioned has a huge storage compartment that sits right behind the back seat, actually in front of the bed, and it actually has a drawer slide out as an option to put your cargo or whatever it is you need back there. So they do have a lot more space because they don't have the traditional drivetrain and powertrain components of a gas-powered vehicle or an internal combustion engine vehicle. Having more storage space off-road is a great thing, whether you want to put, your camping gear in there, you want to put your adventure gear in there, or maybe you want to have some tools or firewood or whatever it is you got. The more space you have, the better it is for you off-road. Now, another one that I really had to think about for a minute was ground clearance, and whether or not that's actually something that electric vehicles do better than internal combustion engines. And what I landed on was that because a lot of these vehicles have independent suspension due to their powertrain, the way that the actual power is delivered to these wheels, you don't have things like differentials that get hung up underneath the vehicle on rocks. Internal combustion engines, Jeeps, Toyotas, they all have, solid rear axles, usually, sometimes solid front axles. And if you're talking about a Jeep Wrangler, Gladiator, or some of the other off-road vehicles out there, and those are things that can get hung up on obstacles on the trail. Now, electric vehicles typically have a very smooth underbelly to them. And while that can be a con, which I will, talk about later on in this episode, it is something that I see as a pro because you have a lot more ground clearance underneath the vehicle. And if you have the suspension and the tires, it really makes it easy to get up and over stuff without having to worry about getting stuck on something underneath you. This is something I really didn't think about until I had an electric vehicle. There are literally no fluids in the car. Internal combustion engines, you've got engine oil, you've got gear oil, you've got differential oil, you've got transmission fluid, you've got power steering fluid, you've got coolant, you have all kinds of fluids. And without these fluids, your car essentially cannot run. That is a huge, huge plus for off-road vehicles, is that you don't have to worry about topping off your fluids or having a line break or something where you lose those fluids, or let's say you have an issue where your transmission is leaking or something like that, and it's going to cause you a lot of problems. And especially if it causes you these problems off-road when you're hundreds of miles away from civilization, that's a huge problem that electric vehicles typically don't have because they have no fluids. And speaking of that, there are also a lot less moving parts when it comes to electric vehicles. You don't have a typical engine, transmission, drive shaft, transfer case, front differential, rear differential, axles, all this stuff that are constantly moving, all these moving parts. This is something that's based in science and engineering, is the more moving parts, the more complex a system is, the more chances you have of actually having a failure of one of those components. And we deal with them all the time as off-roaders, and we come prepared to deal with those things. But wouldn't it be nice to have a very simple drivetrain setup where there aren't a lot of moving parts and therefore a very, very low chance of something breaking? I think electric vehicles have a lot going for them when it comes to the whole moving parts and engineering department, because there really isn't a lot of chances of stuff breaking on them. Last pro that I have on my list of electric vehicles off-road has a lot to do with the environment that you drive off-road vehicles in. And two of the biggest enemies to any vehicle off-road is dust and water. These two things can really mess up your day. If you get dust inside your intake, into your engine, it can really screw things up in there. If you get water inside your engine, you can really have a catastrophic failure of your engine by hydrolocking it. So electric vehicles don't have to deal with these issues. They don't have an intake. They don't take air in from the atmosphere. You can ford them through a lot of deep water without much issues. I think the Rivian can go up to 3 feet of water without having any problems. Now, of course, they do have a lot of electrical components, but if they're manufactured to be off-road, like the Rivian R1T, or let's say like the Hummer EV, or some of the other off-road vehicles that are made with electric platforms. Now, to me, that's a really big benefit of having an electric vehicle off-road, is you don't have to worry about all these external factors and how they may make their way into your engine and cause catastrophic failure. All right, so that's the list of all the benefits or the pros of having an electric vehicle off-road. Stay with me. I know you guys are sitting there just itching in your seat to just bark and yell at me about all the bad things when it comes to electric vehicles and why they're going to be terrible off-road. So I'm going to get to some of those things right now for you guys in our list of cons of an electric vehicle off-road. All right, so right off the bat, the first thing anyone ever tells you when you talk about an electric vehicle off-road, every conversation I've had about electric vehicles off-road, the first thing anyone says is, well, what happens when your battery dies? That's a very valid question. It's something I had to think about for a little while. And it is still definitely a con of having an electric vehicle off-road is the range that you have with these vehicles, and more importantly, the infrastructure about charging them. But when I thought about the actual question of what happens when your battery dies off-road, it wasn't really that far off from like running out of gas in the middle of the desert or in the middle of the mountains, which I've definitely done before. Of course, like filling a gas tank, putting 5 gallons into a tank is much faster than charging an electric vehicle battery enough to get you off the trail. However, the problem still remains is you're stuck. Whether you have no gas or you have a dead battery, you're still stuck out there. The problem with electric vehicles is really in the infrastructure when it comes to how you charge these vehicles. Right now, as it stands, as an electric vehicle owner, just driving around town and sticking to streets and highways, I sometimes find it very difficult to be able to find somewhere to charge my car. It's not always conveniently placed, a charger for me to just pull into, especially a fast DC charger when you can just charge in about 45 minutes or so. They're not very widely available. If you have a Tesla, they're a little bit easier, and I'm sure Tesla's Cybertruck is going to come out at some point. Who knows? It's been like 5 years now. But the Tesla charging infrastructure seems to be a lot better than the traditional, other manufacturers that have, they rely on outside charging infrastructure like Electrify America or ChargePoint or some of the other charging companies that are out there. They just aren't reliable. A lot of times you go to them and they don't even have working chargers there. You have to call and then they'll say they'll reset it and it doesn't really work. Especially when you consider the fact that a lot of us travel for hours just to get to these places where we go off-roading. What do? You have to charge the vehicle, in advance, maybe the night before or something if you have a charger at home, or the morning of before you leave, just to get to the remote location that you want to start your adventure. And then once you're there, you have to somehow make sure that you have enough charge to go on your adventure and get back to a charging station. Right now, that is really not viable for most places that I want to go off-roading. I'm sure a lot of you guys probably can relate to that. There's just no way for me to get out to Death Valley and charge my electric vehicle and then go off-roading and then get back to a charging station and then get home. The infrastructure just isn't there yet. Now, that's not to say that may not change in the future as electric vehicles become more and more prominent in all different kinds of vehicles or all different parts of our lives. However, at this moment, that is the last thing that I want to deal with, is trying to find somewhere to charge my vehicle before I start an adventure and then figure out if I can get back to that same charging station or a different one before I head home. Now, speaking of batteries and charging and all this stuff, the lithium batteries on these vehicles, while they're very, very high tech and they can charge very quickly and they hold a lot of range for what they have, some of them are over 500 miles of range, they have one very, very big and scary weakness. Lithium batteries, once they're punctured or they're hit by something pretty hard, they have a tendency to just blow up. Now, I don't mean like a giant explosion. If you've ever been into RC cars that run on lithium batteries, you've seen them sometimes get puffed up or swelled up if they hit something. And sometimes, if you're really unlucky, those batteries can start to burst into flames and shoot flames out of them. And it can burn the RC car down to the ground. So I took that lesson from my days in RC car building, and I kind of apply it to this idea of like taking a vehicle that's running on a lithium battery off-roading. I hit a lot of stuff when I'm off-roading. Well, if you're rock crawling, you guys have probably come down off of a rock before and just slammed into your slider, or even worse, if you didn't have the armor there, you just hit the body or underbody of the vehicle. Most of these lithium batteries in electric vehicles are along the entire underbelly of the car. Now, that's the best place to put something that big on an electric vehicle, but is it really safe to have that there when you're going to be driving over some jagged rocks or some terrain where that might get hit somehow? That's pretty scary. I've actually seen news stories about people who have taken their electric vehicles off-road, whether or not they were made to go off-road. People have done it before. I've seen Teslas off-road, just regular Model 3s and stuff. And there's been news articles of cars that have burned to the ground because the lithium battery was damaged and therefore started a fire. So that's a huge, huge hazard and a scary, scary one to think about if you're trying to take an electric vehicle off-road. I don't know if in the future they're going to be, really armoring these things, or the batteries are going to get better in technology to where they don't blow up like that. But either way, it's something that I definitely don't want to deal with right now. Now, our next item, our third item on the list of cons when it comes to electric vehicles off-road is that there's generally a very big lack of aftermarket support when it comes to electric vehicles, and a bigger lack of aftermarket support when it comes to electric vehicles that are meant for off-roading. So what I'm talking about is like the Rivian R1T, the R1S. The 4xe really isn't an electric vehicle. It's kind of a hybrid, so it shares a lot of the same componentry as a Jeep Wrangler. It's very much the same, so a lot of those aftermarket components do work, but there's not a big aftermarket push to get lift kits or sliders or bumpers or any of the traditional off-road modifications that you would have on an electric vehicle. Now, with that said, there aren't a lot of things that you have to do to these electric vehicles. You don't need to add lockers to them. You don't need to add, an intake or a snorkel. There really generally isn't a lot of aftermarket support for them. So obviously off-roading is kind of built on aftermarket products. At this moment, it's really not something that a lot of people can take advantage of when they come to building an electric vehicle for off-road use. So I take that as a pretty big downside to owning an electric off-road vehicle. Now, earlier in this episode, I talked about how there are less moving parts when it comes to electric vehicles, and that's a benefit to having them off-road. However, if something were to go wrong with your electric vehicle out in the middle of nowhere, miles and miles from civilization, you're really stuck. Most shade tree mechanics or garage mechanics or people who know how to work on vehicles, like their own vehicles, they can fix most minor problems when it comes to breakages or doing trail repairs off-road. I've done plenty of them in my life, and a lot of times just having the right tool set with me and maybe a couple of spare extra parts that I know are prone to breaking can really help me in getting myself back to the highway, or at least in a position to where I can get myself home somehow. But these new cars, these electric cars, I wouldn't even bother trying to work on them. I think everything needs to be done with a proprietary bespoke computer system, which most consumers do not have. So making trail repairs on these vehicles is definitely a little bit more tricky on an electric vehicle than it is on a traditional, Jeep or a Toyota or a truck or something like that. That's definitely a drawback because a lot of us, we encounter problems all the time on the trail, and we need to have the solutions to fix those problems so that we can keep going. I don't see that really being the case for electric vehicles, and I don't really know how they're going to get around that when it comes to off-road because, things happen all the time anywhere you are in any environment. Anything can happen. And with all those variables out there and not having the tools to work on things, not having the knowledge to work on things really hinders the experience because it doesn't give you a lot of confidence to go out there and push your limits like you would normally with a vehicle that you can work on. A little bit ago, we talked about lithium batteries. Another con of having an electric vehicle off-road is actually those lithium batteries and how they react to different types of weather. So as many of you guys know, lithium batteries really don't like very, very extreme temperature conditions, whether that's very cold or very hot temperatures. Lithium batteries tend to run down very, very fast when it comes to very cold temperatures. And when they get hot, things can go wrong with them as well. So when we're off-roading, we never really know what's going to happen. I found myself on the trail where I woke up that morning and it is below 0 degrees. Up in the Sierra, sometimes it can get down to single digits, no problem. And then other times you're in Death Valley and it's like, a pretty hot time of year and it can get into triple digits, no problem. Sometimes even, higher than that, 110, 115 degrees out in the middle of the desert. So those are conditions in which electric vehicles may have a big problem because the lithium batteries are not going to be able to keep up in those types of weather conditions. And so that brings us to our last point, and it is important, is really one of the biggest drawbacks of electric vehicles kind of as a whole, but more so for off-road, is that they're very costly. They're very expensive vehicles to start out with. Typically electric vehicles or electric options of certain models that exist also with gas engines are $10, $20, sometimes $30,000 more than their gas-powered counterparts. And while the cost of all vehicles has gone up dramatically in the last couple of years, the same is true for electric vehicles. With markups from dealerships, you're no problem getting into the $100,000 range or $150,000 range for some of these vehicles. The Rivian R1Ts, if you don't have a reservation for one, they're easily going to be 150 grand. So the cost of electric vehicles right now is so high that it makes them unattainable for a lot of people who want to go off-roading. And so there you have it. That's the list of the good and the bad side of having an electric vehicle off-road. You know, all the pros and cons I just listed, these are the things that we have to deal with right now with electric vehicles if we wanted to take them on our adventures. And that begs the question, you know, are electric vehicles a viable solution for off-roaders? And my answer is, right now, no, they're not. In the future, they might be. There's a lot of challenges that they have to overcome in order for them to be adopted by the off-road enthusiast space. There's a lot of things that they have to figure out. A lot of aftermarket support has to come into play. They have to figure out the range, how to fast charge these things in places that are very remote. So there's a lot of problems with electric vehicles and how they can work off-road right now, but that's not to say that technology won't catch up in the next two or three decades to where, you know, we may find ourselves all off-roading in electric vehicles by that point. But I think right now it's pretty foolish to think that electric vehicles are a better solution than a traditional internal combustion engine when it comes to off-roading. I'm sure you guys have a ton of different opinions on this stuff, and I'd love to hear what you guys think. Will electric vehicles be the way of the future for off-roaders? You guys have your own opinions. I want to hear about it. What are some of the challenges that you oversee? Maybe some things that I didn't cover in this episode that maybe you guys have thought about. Drop it in the comment section. I'd love to hear about it and start that discussion, because I think it's important to talk about this stuff, especially with the way that our automotive industry is moving towards this electric platform. What is that going to do for us enthusiasts who are so tightly holding on to our gas-powered and diesel-powered or internal combustion engine vehicles, and we rely on those vehicles to get us from point A to point B, not just around town, but also on our adventures when we're hundreds and hundreds of miles away from the nearest charging station. But that is going to do it for today's discussion, you guys. I appreciate you following along and being a part of this. I know that this is going to be something that's going to be a topic for a lot of people coming up very soon, especially with all these different manufacturers coming out with electric vehicles. So I'd love to hear your opinion on that. And please, 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 if you haven't already done so, subscribe to Driving Line, because we're making videos for every type of car enthusiast out there, whether you're into off-road, lowered trucks, muscle cars, electric vehicles even. I'm doing a couple episodes on that. And you guys can actually keep up to date on Chasing Dust as well. I'm going to be doing a new project with those Recon Grapplers right there that I'm very, very excited to show you guys. So if you guys are subscribed, you'll be able to see how that project develops further on. But that's going to do it for today, you guys. I appreciate you following along. Once again, this has been your host, Matt McAdam, aka Desert Chief, only on Driving Line. And I'll catch you guys on the next one. Thanks for watching Driving Line. If you guys like this video, consider subscribing to our channel so you'll never miss any of the content we create here. Whether you're into trucks, Jeeps, imports, domestic vehicles, or anything in between, we are here to fuel your passion. So hit that subscribe button and we'll see you guys next time.